Hei, Knut igjen.
Hei.
Ja, du også vår lørdagsgjest i SEILmagasinet. Men vi har funnet ut at vi tar dette intervjuet på engelsk fordi du har mange interessante synspunkter på internasjonal seiling, og ikke minst det som foregår i world sailing når det gjelder short-handed, double-handed mixed. Og da tar vi det på engelsk. Så da begynner vi like godt med det. Og så sier vi, hello Knut. You have been quite a lot involved in the games around the double-handed mixed event for the Olympics. Can you tell me a bit about your position here?
I can do that. I like to sort of correct a little bit on how much involved I've been, because it's only recently that I joined Larry Rosenfeld and Stan Honey in creating this new class association for the double-handed, which I think is an exciting initiative. But I have known about that initiative for quite some time. My good friend Mark Turner was quite involved in driving that into world sailing when he worked for us as a consultant for world sailing many years ago. And I also know David Graham really well. He's a good friend of mine, the new CEO of World Sailing. He was actually the one who got me into that double-handed organization to start with. And I also happen to know the new president, although I haven't discussed the double-handed with him, but I worked with Lee Kon-hai quite a lot with the World Ocean Race when China was a very strategic mission for us in the World Ocean Race to bring Chinese sailors, Chinese boats, Chinese stopovers, and Chinese sponsors into that race. So, and he was involved in all of that. So I know him well. But I think my view on the double-handed, I think, first of all, I think it's one of the most exciting opportunities world sailing has had in a very long time. And I have been an advocate for many years that one of the challenges world sailing has had for many years has been that it somehow decided many years ago, and this is many years ago, to focus its activities entirely around the Olympic Games. And what it did at the same time, it kind of left the control and the involvement in all the other parts of sailing. So if you look at all the big parts of sailing that drives commercial sailing, sponsorship, media, world sailing is not at all involved in it. They're not at all involved in the America's Cup. They're not at all involved in the World Ocean Race. They're not involved in On the Globe. They're not involved in Jacques Vabre. They're not involved in any of these events, apart from creating some rules that the sailors can use. But that's a very slim involvement. And that's also, in my opinion, world sailing's commercial challenge. They're not involved where the sailing is commercial. And then they're left with the Olympic Games and the dinghies and the ports and trying to commercialize that and trying to generate revenues and etc. And I think that's it's very hard for world sailing to comprehend how they're going to get out of that. Someone told me a very interesting story the other day that if you wind the clock back many years, you will get to a time when golf and sailing had the same population. And at some stage, the federation in golf decided to put its arms around all of golf. You cannot go and just organize your own tour in golf. It has to go through the organization. While world sailing decided to only put its arms around the Olympics, and then they let everything else run almost like, I'm sorry to use the word anarchy, because today, anyone who wants can organize whatever event he wants in sailing. There's no one's new. There's new round the world races popping up here and popping up there, and anyone can claim anything and make anything. That's not possible in football. That's not possible in golf, and it's not possible in Formula One or motorsports. But in sailing, you can do what you want. And that's the problem. So world sailing is not involved where the general population is following sailing or where the money is. I mean, look at the financials. You know, I just seen all this criticism that has been on the recent organization in world sailing. I mean, they're talking about a staff of, what is it, 20 people? You probably know a lot more than I do about that. 20, 25 people?
30 people.
30 people. I mean, that's the same staff that runs Figaro. World Ocean Race had 180 people full-time paid to run a sailing event. The World Sailing has 30 people to drive our sport. For me, it's so reversed. And this is not fixed overnight. But the reality is that offshore sailing drives a lot more commercial and audience than any other part of the sailing. And I'm the biggest fan of the Olympic classes on the planet. I really follow all the Norwegian. I mean, Norway has a fantastic team now in the Olympics. I think we are starting to really build a new generation, which is super impressive. But the reality is, there's very few people in Norway sailing those 49ers at home, apart from the Olympic sailors. When I was sailing Flying Dutchman, it was me and it was 2 other boats, Onul Petter and 2 other boats, and we were all doing the Olympic Games. There was no one back home in Asker or Norway anywhere sailing those. And that is the reality for most of the Olympic classes. So they're not really relevant for the bigger audience that are sailors today. And then you have the audience that is not sailors. I mean, just look at the Vendée Globe, for example, right now. I mean, and the Vendée Globe, in my opinion, is not doing a big effort to make it a global event. I mean, there's hardly media coverage outside France, you know, apart from the sailing media, obviously, but it's not easily accessible. I mean, yesterday I had a look, and it's now more than 900,000 people playing virtual regatta in Vendée Globe. 900,000 people. That's more people than ever followed Olympic Games in sailing, just playing virtual regatta in offshore sailing. And it's a reason for it. It's a reason for it. And there are many reasons. One of them is that sailing is a decision-making sport. It's an endurance sport. It has weather components. It has a lot of different variables that makes it challenging and fun to follow. And it has a lot of drama, and it's beautiful for content, and it's fantastic as a billboard for sponsors because it has area and it has space. You know, and Vendée Globe Open 60 is a lot more interesting as a billboard than a small dinghy. Unfortunately, that's the reality. However, World Sailing has no connection with this part of sailing. It doesn't get a cent from it, from the fact that in the World Ocean, we used to send a few $100,000 every year to World Sailing as a fee to be a special event. But World Sailing is not even connected to it. They can't even grab any opportunity there. And for me, to introduce this class in the Olympic Games is the first opportunity I have seen that World Sailing has to actually take ownership and get involved and use that sport that I think will have a very strong following for many, many reasons. I think, first of all, the mixed thing, we have tried to get women into sailing for a long time. The route for women into sailing is through offshore. That's my opinion. I mean, the Olympic classes are fantastic, but the reality is that in offshore is the only place in sailing we have seen women compete with men on fairly competitive terms, right? And that is because it's a decision-making sport more than a physical sport. It's really about making smart decisions. And also, you know, when you're single-handed, your percentage of what your one single person can contribute with, it's fairly limited. You look at the Vendée Globe now, you look at Sam Davis, I mean, she's super competitive. And she can even win the Vendée Globe. I wouldn't be surprised if she does, actually, as the rest will struggle, and the new boss will struggle as well to get to the finish line. But I think so, and then I think the whole media concept around the double-handed is incredibly fascinating. I mean, we can do so much more with a boat where you have space to put cameras and equipment. I mean, I'm very impressed with the IMOCA sailors now. I mean, how they are producing media now compared to the last Vendée Globe. I mean, you look at Alex Thommessen. He has an automated system on his arm where he switches cameras. He does interviews every day. He really makes an effort to film himself fixing the boat or whatever. The guys even film themselves with drones, single-handed. Things that is impossible to do, unfortunately, from a 49er. It's really difficult to do that from a 49er, but you can do it from a different platform. So for me, it's an opportunity for World Sailing to connect with the wider sailing and also to get more involved in offshore. And I wish that World Sailing was more involved. Stanley, who sits on the double with me, he's also involved in the offshore committee in World Sailing. And you know that they have just been basically busy writing rules. That's what they have done for many years. And that's not involvement. And I think the commercial side of World Sailing is so important for our future. All the revenue, most of the revenues in World Sailing today comes from IOC, and that's not sustainable long term. That's not sustainable. Unfortunately, I don't believe that the Olympic Games are going to be able to maintain its position forever. It's too much competition of people's attention outside the Olympics. So it's not likely that IOC's revenues are growing. It's more declining. And I think World Sailing needs more legs to stand on. And then I think, yeah, we could speak forever about that. But I think it's also fantastic timing right now, because what we saw in offshore sailing in the last years is that more and more Olympic sailors got into offshore. I mean, if you look at the last 2 or 3 World Ocean races, I think almost 40% of the crew came from the Olympics. 40%. I mean, Torben Grael, Olympic gold, Martina Grael, Ian Walker, Carlin Brower, Annie Lush, Sally Barker, Paul Kayard, John Kostecki, Trini Bermudez, you know, even the guy from Abu Dhabi, Olympic Beijing, Chris Nicholson, I think is 2 or 3 times Olympics. All of them are Olympic sailors, and they're all into offshore sailing now. So that those 2 worlds has already melted, which has driven the intensity in the offshore sailing up massive steps. I was quite fun yesterday. I think I was watching the guys starting in the Jules Verne Trophy, where my friend Thomas Coville is having one boat, and Frank Camas is having the other, which is one of the most insane match races that sailing has ever seen on the planet, right? And Thomas was doing 41.5 knots. I mean, he was sitting on 40 knot speed across the start line, right, in the middle of the night. And then you have Frank starting just behind, and then suddenly they're neck and neck, side by side, and then they said, this is like sailing the Volvo Ocean Race, just doing 40 knots. That's what they said. And that's how it has become, right? In offshore sailing, it's Olympic Games, but 24 hours a day. And I think it's a fantastic story. So I think for sailing, it would be beautiful. Then we can argue about boats. And that seems to be a sort of typical black hole that sailing always get into, unfortunately. And I've been a big promoter of getting out of that hole with the one design fleet that we built in the Volvo Ocean Race. I still believe that is the right thing for sailing, because when we let the boat designers and the sailors run the show, then it becomes about boats. And frankly, the only thing you can achieve by that discussion is disaster, in my opinion, because you end up in a cost race, technical race, etc. And it doesn't. I think this one is an easy one to solve. There are plenty of boats you can do double-handed in. There are plenty of new good boats, and for the first time, you can get the industry involved. For the first time, we can get the boating industry involved. We can get Beneteau, we can get Hanse, we can get the big yards involved in the sport. And there is a boat suddenly in the Olympics that they can sell to people that are not doing the Olympics. But people talk about the cost of this boat. The cost of buying a brand new 49er, or 2 of them, that you can't sell after the games. That is the cost. I wouldn't hesitate to buy a Daler 30 or a Sunfast. I could sell it for a decent price 2 years after, because even in Norway, I can find 50 people who wants to buy it. Right? How many people do you find in Oslo who wants to buy the 49er? I mean, unless you almost give it away. So I think that the technical thing is the easiest. What we should talk about, what the debate should be about, is what opportunity is this for world sailing, and how do we leverage that opportunity? How do we start to think about the media production, the graphics we can present, the stories we can build about men and women, about this whole 24 hours. It's marathon. It's like long distance thing. And I think the world now, if you look at all the endurance sports, which have been growing tremendously in the last 5, 6, 7 years, in particular in Europe, but everywhere in the world. I mean, people are running longer now. They are running top mountains. They are doing triathlon is growing faster than ever. Everything about endurance, long distance, and pace is something people can relate to today, and that is the story. So I hope that we get into that discussion and not have too much questions about what boat should we have, because that has to be solved, and world sailing should stop debating this and instead get on to solving it. I proposal they have about leaving it late is good. I don't think it's a problem. I think people make this a problem, because I have been doing a few Olympic campaigns myself. I remember when I did my windsurfing campaign in 1988, we did not know what board we were going to race the Olympics before the year before. Then the Lechner was decided. We all thought it was going to be a Swedish board called Davidson, and we had this board. The Norwegian team had all bought Davidson board, and suddenly we all had to buy Lechners, and everyone was screaming and everyone was yelling, and then we solved it, right? The same thing. Yngling was announced as a class for women and keel boats. How many Ynglings at that time when it was announced was it around the world? How many Ynglings was it in Asia at that time? None, not one, not one, right? It was Ynglings in Norway and Denmark. So, I mean, these situations have happened every time. It's not a new thing. The difference is that if you can go double-handed offshore sailing, you can find boats pretty much in every country today. You can. It's not exactly the same boat that you will race in the games, but so what? No one knows that boat yet. And you can achieve, I would say, a big part of the sailing. I have a lot of my old sailing friends have gotten into double-handed now because of this. even Kenny Reed has started sailing offshore again, right? You had kind of left the scene completely. I mean, he's still busy running North Sails, but now he's out sailing. The best female sailors who were winning the Olympic Games a few games ago in the UK here have started going offshore sailing, and they have plenty of boats to sail on. They're out sailing Sunfast boats, and they're sailing some Daler, and they're sailing some boats, and they're out training. They have plenty to learn. So yeah. So as you see, I'm engaged in it. I care about it because I just see an opportunity for world sailing that I think world sailing should grab.
Yeah, I think that it's hard to argue that. The question is, as you say, about boats and how it's feasible to make this happen before the Olympics. We're talking 3 years between the Tokyo 2021 and Paris 2024. We are in a very difficult financial situation around the world. We don't know what's going to happen. One of the reasons why shorthanded has had such a huge success lately is, of course, because of the pandemic, which has made 2 people sail together rather than having a crew of 10. So yeah. In a way that came as a blessing in disguise for shorthanded sailing. And everybody agrees that it is a good thing, and it is probably an opportunity that world sailing should grab. The question is how they can do it, and how soon can they get it into the Olympics. It's going to be decided very shortly, actually, because IOC have their meetings already. I think even this or next week, the program committee will have a say on it, and then the executive committee in the middle of December will have a say. That, I think, is pretty much going to decide whether we will have that class in the Olympics in 2024 or not. So if the answer is no, then we have to work, or you or everybody have to work to promote a double-handed mix in other arenas and prepare for 2028. When I think you have a lot more time to develop a sustainable class. It should be a one design class, I agree with you. Whether it should be one of the existing ones or a new class, we don't know. And we know that it does take some time to develop a new class.
Yeah, I think that whether it becomes Olympic class or not, I mean, short-handed sailing is growing everywhere. And it started growing last year. So I think, I mean, look at Figaro, which is a fairly expensive boat, right, to buy, the new Figaro. I mean, it has record numbers. Vendée Globe has record numbers. A lot of the short-handed events now, even now, Sydney Hobart has now a double-handed class, right? And it was a very big number entering until they announced that they didn't want a double-handed to win Hobart, which was a bit of an interesting discussion because of autopilot. So now some of the boats pulled out. But I think I think this is not. We have to turn the dial. This is not about saving double-handed offshore. Double-handed offshore doesn't need world sailing. Double-handed offshore will continue. It's driven by other people than world sailing today, completely. It's driven by a lot of French people. It's driven by sponsors. There's a huge, I mean, there is more, I would say there's more full-time sailors. I would take my mouth a little bit full here. Full-time sailors in double-handed and single-handed sailing than there is almost in the Olympic Games. Full-time. There's a lot of people who make a living from this today. Hundreds, right? And so don't underestimate that this is the force that world sailing is not even close to. And they need to see that opportunity for them to grab it. And I think the only challenge they should talk about is how do we get enough boats to the countries that don't have boats, which has been the same problem from every Olympic class you had. And look at Norway. We take an example. We know Norway fairly well, right? Norway does not participate in all the Olympic classes because we don't even have enough sailors for that. We certainly don't have the money or the sailors for that. That's Norway. And then we are so worried that this boat, I can guarantee you that we will get a Norwegian team in offshore doubles. I'm much more comfortable that will happen. Whether they will qualify is another thing, or whether we will make the finals is another thing. But that we will get someone out on the water. But to get someone out in all these other Olympic classes where you have to start from scratch, you have to buy the first boats, you don't have anyone else in the country who knows how to sail them. So you have to go abroad and learn how to sail them. There's plenty of people in Norway sailing double-handed. It doesn't mean that they're on the Olympic level, but you can go out there and start sailing right away in home waters. So I think that we should focus that boat discussion about what is the real challenge we are up against, because the challenge is, and I've heard that people say, are we not going to have boats that are identical? That's rubbish. Like we managed to make 65-foot carbon racing boats so identical that the most peculiar and picky and professional sailors in the world never ever managed to find any difference on them. If we can do that with those boats, of course we can do it with a 30-foot boat. That's just about putting scantling and rules and how you check the production and things like that in place. It's not difficult to achieve. It's fairly simple to achieve. Hanse can do it. The Hanse with Dealer can do it. Dufour can do it. Chanot can do it. With Beneteau, there are plenty of yards, like J-boats can do it. There are plenty of yards that can build these boats. I'm really not worried about that one. Its question is like, how do we get 1 or 2 boats to China, 1 or 2 boats to this in this country, 1 or 2 boats to this in this country, and then we have to say, okay, what is success? Because all these countries we talk about do not have all the Olympic classes today. So that is not, it's not like every Olympic class goes to every single country. Some of the countries in the world only have 1 of the Olympic classes active in their country today, only 1, right? So, and that is the truth. I've been to many of these countries with the World Waters race where sailing is a developing sport, and it's starting. You take the south of Brazil, for example, or it's an Olympic country. But if you look at the wider space, take Uruguay, take Middle East, take China. I mean, you don't see all the Olympic classes in China. You see a few, 2, 3 of the Olympic classes. They're active, and that's how it's been for years. And I don't think it's going to change. I don't think it's going to change.
Okay, well, that is very, very interesting. We will see what happens. And anyway, you haven't quite answered the challenges of having a class ready for the 2024 Olympics, but that we're...
Well, I don't understand what the problem is. What is the problem? I mean, Dealer is going to produce more than 30 boats of the Dealer 1 design way in time for that, and they can easily produce the 30 boats for the Olympics. What is the problem? I supply more than 40% of the sailing industry with electronics. I know them super well. I know their capacity. I know their building scale. What's the problem? I don't understand what the problem is. Beneteau can do it. There's the financial problem to pay for these boats, but I've spoken to Dealer, I've spoken to Beneteau. These guys, let's sit down and talk. How do you build enough boats in time? I just don't see the problem. So of course someone has to buy these boats, but God forbid, it's a lot better to have some of the biggest boat yards in the world. I mean, Beneteau produces more than 10,000 boats a year. To be involved in the Olympics than to start with some small little German yard that builds star boats or something like that, 20 a year, and you try to figure out how am I going to get around the world. I mean, the only one in the Olympic Games that has capacity today to build boats is Starboard, who build windsurfers, and they are the only one who can get scale quickly. All the other boats in the Olympics are dependent on tiny little boat yards, licensed boat yards that makes 1 boat at a time. They make 1 boat in 5 days or 10 days or something, and then they make another boat. And Beneteau and Hanse and Chanot and Grand Soleil and J-boats and all these yards, they have at least some scale, and they have an industrial production, and they have an interest in this because they sell these boats. If we choose a boat that also has a commercial market, which I hope we will do, and not do something silly and create a new thing. Because so I don't see that there's a capacity problem to build these boats. The question is, what is the world going to say before we get there, before we get to the decision about that Olympic boat? And what they have given now is a parameter of how long the boat should be between here and here. And there is already, I don't think there's something like 10 boats existing that are very good boats in that space. So if a country wants to get into offshore sailing today, you can go and buy a Sunfast tomorrow. You can order it, or a Dealer, or an L30, or and get going with it. So yes. That's my view. I don't see that's the bottleneck. It's going to be a little bit of criticism for sure, but look at the other Olympic classes and their spread and their international sort of foothold with how many boats you find of these Olympic classes in every single country. And you will find that in some countries, you will find a lot of these boats. And in those countries, you will find a lot of 30-foot boats as well, most likely. And in some countries, there are just 1 or 2 classes. So it's probably a bit controversial to say that. And I know Olympics is a lot about politics and it's a lot about getting all the countries involved. But I look at it from a world sailing perspective. If I was running world sailing, I would be desperate to make this happen because I would try to fix my finances. And that's what I think world sailing needs to do long term. They cannot just sit and hope that they stay in the Olympic Games and that's where all their money is going to come from. They have to have other involvements in sailing that are outside just dinghies and boards. You go into the Olympic. I went into the World Sailing webpage yesterday just to check how they're doing, and you go on their YouTube channels, right, and you look at the videos they post. Take a look. Go and look at it. I mean, it's great. It's all about Olympics classes, and it's all about dinghies and boards, and most of the videos have 200-300 views. That is nothing. That is not even touching the market. I mean, even Alex Thommessen alone is like 30 to 100,000 views on every video he posts now on the globe, alone on his own page, not on the globe's page. So then World Sailing needs to get in where sailing has a strong interest. They should stay with the Olympic classes, but they need to move their focus into where the future is and where they can leverage the sport, where they can get involved in media, in content, communication with a wider audience, recruitment, courses, drive new people to boating. I mean, this year has been the biggest year in almost boating's history, with newcomers coming into boating. It's been an amazing, despite the pandemic we are in. In the US, we think we're going to sell 300,000 new powerboats this year. It's the biggest growth as for many years. Sailing hasn't grown as much. But what has happened is that there's a lot of new people that has come into boating. A lot of new people. And that's where World Sailing needs to be on the agenda. Because sailing is more difficult to get into than powerboats. Powerboats have had most of that growth comes from powerboats. Sailing has actually struggled, in particular through the first 6 months, because it's difficult to buy a sailboat. You both have to buy a boat and you have to learn to sail. You buy a powerboat, you turn the key, and you can pretty much drive a powerboat. It's not that difficult to drive a powerboat. And that means that the barrier to buy a sailboat is that you need to come with education and training. Here in the UK, where I live, the RYA is the best in the world on this. They drive education everywhere. I mean, you can walk even up and down Thommessen, and there's like sailing training and courses and offshore captain courses and all these things. And they get people in. That's where World Sailing should be. But they're not. It's not World Sailing that's driving that agenda. They need to be on the part of sailing that most people are going to meet, most people are going to experience, and most people will follow. That's my mission. That's what I think is important. And I saw this as an opportunity.
Okay, so much about World Sailing and offshore double. A very convincing argument, and I think that you are right. It's the future. Short-handed and mixed is very much a part of the future, and the World Sailing certainly should reap from that. There is no doubt about it. But there are other things in sailing too. You mentioned America's Cup, which is still a major event. 4 teams, put a lot of attention, technological people, everything. How do you see America's Cup going compared to the GP Sail GP class, for instance?
Well, America's Cup is something that people always have very strong opinions, right, in sailing. I mean, for me, the America's Cup is what it is. It's kind of it's a very special, unique event, which has rules written many years ago, right, where you own the event, which means that there's very hard to have any consistency in the event, because the game is to win the event and own it, and then you decide the future. So it's gonna change. And it doesn't really have to be driven by, it doesn't have to reach an audience. It doesn't have to have commercial validity. It doesn't have to have many participants. It actually only needs 2 boats in the end. Some people think that it should have 20 boats or something, but that's not the real America's Cup rule, how it's written. It's not incentivizing mass participation or anything like that. So it's driving technology. I think it's fascinating. I think it's impressive. I'm a little bit involved because we are sponsoring some of the teams with our equipment. In particular, Ineos, we have our equipment on the Emirates Team New Zealand as well, so we get a little bit involved in it, and it's amazing what they're able to do. I mean, they're talking about 50 knots in an inshore race, and they are changing the sport. They are developing a lot of things. Whether it drives the sport in the right direction, that I'm questioning about. So I guess that my criticism is not about the participation, because I think that it still has the flair and it has the amazing teams. And for me, it's fascinating to follow. And I think if you're technically interested as a sailor, you think this is fun to follow. But I think I'm skeptical to what is happening with sailing when everyone thinks that the future of sailing is foiling. Because I think that, I did a presentation for the Norwegian Federation some years ago, where I said that, take a look at Magnus Carlsen, and think why Magnus Carlsen has been such a popular icon in Norway, and why chess suddenly became popular. Chess hasn't become faster; it is not more extreme. It doesn't go on foils, right? Chess is popular. It's a smart game where you have to use your brain. I mean, I think Netflix's most popular series right now is about chess, right? And it's a brain sport. It's a decision-making sport. That's how I grew up with sailing, and I went through this journey many times in my life as a sailor, where particularly with my windsurfing career, when windsurfing completely screwed this up. And we had a fantastic sport. We had so many participants that you had to qualify even for the national championship in Norway back in the early 80s. And then qualify, we had 7 weight classes in the world championship. It was so many people. We were racing triangular courses. You had to be a good strategist. You had to be a good tactician. We could race in any wind condition. And suddenly we let board designers and technology run away with the sport. And suddenly we were having so much equipment that we couldn't even carry it on a car. And we couldn't race unless it was 12 knots away. And we were just going back and forth in a figure of 8. And the whole strategy and the whole tactical aspect of sailing disappeared. It was just about winning the start. And the sport died. It died, right? Completely died. And now I'm a little bit afraid we're going the same direction, that sailing is all about speed and it's all about being airborne. And you take more and more of the strategic and tactical element away from it. And it becomes more like an equipment race, because the problem when you go so fast on foils is that if anything is broken and anything doesn't work, or you are a little bit too heavy so you don't get up, the impact enormous. If you weigh 5 kilos more in a light flying foiling boat, and the wind is just in this borderline where you are not foiling, but the light guy next to you is foiling, it doesn't matter how good you are. It doesn't matter how good you are in strategy and tactics or anything. You're going to be half the boat speed. So, and I think that, I fight it against that in the Volvo Ocean Race, even though I love fast boats. As you know, I've been sailing trimarans and all kinds of things in my past. And I think it's amazingly fun. But I think we should isolate that to some part of sailing and not everywhere. And that's why I think in offshore sailing, I think unless you can finish the race, I don't think you have the right technology. And now you can look at the Vendée Globe. Sorry to be criticizing it, but I think that the ocean race should not go with the Mokka 60s. And I think if everyone doesn't understand why watching it right now, then I think you have a problem. There's only 3 boats left of the new fleet that are seriously damaged. So they are not able to even close the race to their potential. Either they have completely broken and gone back and returned and fixed the boat, or broken the mast, or damaged the structure, or delaminated, or they have lost the foil. And then you see there's a 14-year-old boat from Jean Le Cam that is still competitive up there. And that's, to me, showing that we need to get the fuller picture. And getting to the finish line, having comparable boats, and being able to have a strategic game is what is fascinating. That's why offshore is popular, because it's a strategic game. And using your brain. And I think, I had a photo that I showed in Norwegian Federation about a small kid that was sitting in an Optimist in the academy we were running in the Volvo Ocean Race. And he was drifting around in no wind, right, in Cape Town. And I said that, what does it look like? For most kids, this will look extremely boring. Looking at the little kid sitting on an edge on the rail of an Optimist, drifting around in no wind, and the boat looks boring, it doesn't move. What you don't see in that picture is that kid has now about 20 different decisions he has to make. Is he going to choose left? Is he going to choose right? Is he covering his opponents, or is he not covering his opponent? Does he think what's going to happen on the further up the race course? Is he going to go either further on the right side, or is he going to change his trim or not? Even though the boat is not moving, you don't see all these decisions going, which is the chess on the water, that I think we should never underestimate and forget. And I think if you take that away from sailing, you end up in a technical speed race, and I think you lose the majority of your audience. That's my view. So that's my comment to the America's Cup is fun to follow. I don't think it drives the sport in the right direction, but I think it's fun to follow.
Before we end this conversation, Knut, tell me about your own field, marine electronics, especially for the racing type and also cruising.
Yeah, no, we are having an amazing market right now because boating has been growing so much this year, in particular in the US, not everywhere in Europe, but in Norway has had a really strong year. When it comes to sailing, which is part of what we do with BNG, sailing is our smallest market. I mean, I would say sailing on the global basis is about 10% of the boating market. Sailing has not been as strong this year as powerboats, simply because it's very impacted by France, and France had a very tough lockdown where a lot of the manufacturing in France was actually closed for 2-3 months. So a lot of boats in the sailing world did not get built this year, while in the US boat building has been running pretty much non-stop the whole year. In Italy as well, quite strong. So sailing has a little bit, but right now we are seeing a very strong trend in sailing. We are seeing more people getting into sailing. Next year looks promising. I'm really optimistic for that. With the racing side, has obviously been completely dry this year because most of the sailing events have been cancelled. So very little racing activity. And racing is kind of a smaller part of what we're doing. Or a very small part of what BNG is doing, but it's an important one. We are obviously very involved in the Vendée Globe. We almost have equipment, I think, on 80% of the boats, and we are involved with the 2 Jules Verne's boats, and we are involved in some of the America's Cup. I wouldn't say we have our instruments there, but we have at least our wind sensors and a few other things on those boats. So. And I think in general, we are trying to make sailing easier and more accessible for most people. So we are focusing a lot on the newcomers in the sport with our electronics. We have, for example, an interesting trend we are seeing now with the boat clubs. I don't know if you have followed that, but there's something called, for example, there's one called Freedom Boat Club, which is basically a commercial club where people share ownership of a boat. It's not the same as a charter business. It's actually that you are a member, and with your membership, you have access to a boat. And it's really been growing a lot this year. More with power boats again than with sailboats, but it's also growing with sailboats, which brings a lot of new people, a lot of women, very big growth in female sailors, which is super interesting. And that means that people can have a share of an ownership of a fleet of boats, and they can have so many weeks in a year they can use them. Here in the UK, it exists successfully. It's mainly in the US at the moment. And it's also in the local destinations. So you have it where people live, not in tropical places or in the Mediterranean or something where the charter fleet have been. Because charter has obviously been completely down this year due to COVID, because people have to fly to get to a charter boat, right? So I believe in these new forms of ownership. I think that's going to come. I hope it's going to come to Scandinavia as well, where there can be a fleet of boats that many people can share, because as we know, a lot of people have boats they don't use enough. And that provides an accessibility to boat for a decent cost, which I think is the future.
But so we are working on that. Where is the technology taking us? What is the new technology?
The new technology is, I would say, it's more electronics than it was in the past, in the sense that the electronics is taking up a bigger space of the boat. So the screens get bigger, so you can see more, because it becomes more affordable to have a big screen on the boat, and a big screen with high resolution can give you really good maps, really good information, more data, etc. And then we are working a lot these days on integration. So how one box or one screen is integrated with everything else on the boat, including your watch and including your telephone, your mobile phone. So that's I think the big trends everyone is working very hard on now. We just launched a new product with BNG, what's called Nemesis, which is a typical mast display, or a display you put in a boat, but you can do anything with it. You can watch TV on it. You can plug cameras, and you can mix all these things together, and we can make it intelligent as well. So it will know that when you round the top mark, it will change the information for you. So you will always have what's relevant for you. When you are reaching, you will have a different information than when you're upwind, for example. And it will tell you the distance to the next mark, and it will tell you that you want to see the apparent wind angle when you're reaching, and you want to see the true wind angle when you're upwind, for example. And then it will make those numbers bigger and smaller, and it will show you the trends with the wind shifts depending on, and that you don't need the wind shifts as much when you're reaching, for example. So we are seeing more intelligence and more, but in a very user-friendly way. So everything is touch and scroll and pitch, and the things you are used to from your phone. And then I think we are trying to simplify the journey for everyone. So setting up an autopilot is going to be much easier in the future. And what you have in your home and what you have in your car will be more accessible in the boat. You know, music, the maps, the messages on your phone. You will get it if you want. You will get it on the boat as well, the same way as you get it in the car and in your house. That's I think that's the big trends.
Okay, Knut, thank you very much for your time. This has been very interesting in many respects, and we'll see what happens.
Absolutely. The future is bright.
Absolutely. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.